culture series. And this is the third of 3 this semester, and many of you are here for Katie Polachek, who is our presenter. Just a couple things to note. First is if you could please turn off your cell phones, that would be helpful to her as a presenter. Second is that Katie will be giving her talk with some clips that'll last about a half hour, and then it'll be an open discussion. So if you have questions for her or comments, anyone can add in those at that point. And anything else you want them to know? She's ready to do this, and you are ready to hear, aren't you? So without further ado, Katie, you want to tell me the title of your talk too?
Yeah. So last year I took a Shakespeare and film course with Dr. Easterling. Shout out, she's back there, which was a wonderful class, and you shall take it. And I ended up not talking a lot about Shakespeare in everything that I wrote, because we talked about adapting Shakespeare and what it means to put something that's as classic and as well known as Shakespeare is on the screen for a mainstream audience, and what that means both for the audience and for Shakespeare and how we think of it. So we read The Taming of the Shrew, which I don't know, I believe some of you are in a Shakespeare class, right? Did you guys read it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you read it. Okay. So read it, great, yeah, kind of infuriating. I had seen it in high school, and I went to an all-girls high school, and we showed up. There were a bunch of other schools there. We saw the performance. And afterwards, at the very end, when Katerina's like kneeling on the ground, like, yes, you're the best, yay. Everyone was like, woo! And I was like, are you kidding me? This is the worst ending ever. So then, fast forward like 4 years, and the Shakespeare and film part of the class was that we watched 10 Things I Hate About You after we read Taming of the Shrew. And very different, but still sort of infuriating. And what confused me was that so many people that I knew, so many of my friends, my little sister, loved the film, like loved it, and then everything I read about it as scholarly criticism absolutely tore it apart, hated it, said it was sexist and outdated and terrible, which is weird. And just this past weekend, I was rewatching it, and I am an RA in CM, had like 6 girls come into my room and be like, oh my gosh, I love this movie. And that like sort of confuses me, and I also understand it. So that's the basis of this paper that I wrote for the class. So it's called Personhood and a String of Pearls, Reconciling 10 Things I Hate About You, and it's feminist criticism. So I thought to start out, we would watch the trailer, just to give you a little bit of a refresher on the movie. It's very 1999, very fun.
There's a difference between light and love, because I like my Skechers, but I love my Prada backpack.
Bianca Stratford is the most popular girl at Padua High.
You're asking me out?
I'm down. I've got the 411. And you are not going out and getting jiggy with some boy. I don't care how dope his ride is.
Her sister, Kat, is something else entirely.
People perceive you as somewhat tempestuous. Hair switch is the term used most often.
The only thing they have in common
I am the only girl in school who's not dating.
Oh, no, you're not. Your sister doesn't date.
is one simple rule.
Okay, you can date. When she does.
But she's a mutant. What if she never dates?
Then you'll never date. Oh, I like that.
For Cameron,
No one will go out with her.
it's a problem.
Would any of you be interested in dating Katerina Stratford?
Maybe if we were the last 2 people alive. And there were no goats. Are there goats?
For Patrick,
And what about him? I heard he ate a live duck once.
Everything but the beak and feet.
it's a challenge.
So you two are gonna help me tame the wild beast?
Absolutely.
And for Kat, it's about time.
Well, come on, think about it. Me with my arm around you.
You covered in my vomit.
I'd like to discuss tomorrow night with you. Now, as you know, it's the prom.
Touchstone Pictures presents
Stay cool, bro. Yes, yeah.
a story for every guy who's ever tried.
You never give up, do you?
Was that a yes?
No!
Well, then was that a no?
No!
Every girl who's ever hoped.
You're not as vile as I thought you were.
This is not good.
And anyone who's ever been taken completely by surprise.
She kissed me.
Where?
In the car.
Concentrating awfully hard considering it's gym class.
10 Things I Hate About You.
So, I didn't actually write even about Shakespeare, like I said before, or about the entire movie, but mostly just the first minute of the movie. So I'm going to show that before I say anything else. Okay, so 10 Things I Hate About You is one of the best loved films by the generation that's in college right now and younger, which I think is significant, mostly because I was 5 when this movie came out. And websites like BuzzFeed and Tumblr are littered with memes, GIFs, screen caps, and articles like the Kat Stratford Guide to Being an Awesome Feminist and A Million Things We Loved About 10 Things I Hate About You, which were published in 2013 and 2014, and the movie came out in 1999. But in my research of the scholarly criticism of the movie, there's barely any praise at all. It would seem that the film is loved almost exclusively by those to whom it was originally marketed, so teenagers. And I found that the things that critics, and especially feminist critics, find entirely problematic about the film are the same things that the people who love the film love about the film. So, for example, Kat's self-proclaimed feminism, especially that first scene where she's driving into Bad Reputation, the love relationship between Kat and Patrick, and the resolution, or Kat's taming, which is the reference to the Shakespearean work. And not only did the two parties disagree on the intention and reception of the themes, but critics also cite them as examples of failure to implement feminism to the movie, where it's one of its goals. So if fans call Kat an awesome feminist, and critics describe the film as conservative or even anti-feminist, there's evidently some discrepancy about the definition of feminism between the different groups, and because the different groups have mostly different ages, between generations. A rift exists between those who believe adapting feminism destroys it, and those who believe it allows the adapters personal ownership of and closeness to the feminist tradition. In the way that this dissension centers on what counts as real feminism, this film is emblematic of tensions about what's happening in feminism at the current moment. A conflict between what feminism is and where it has been, or to whom it could extend. The argument is similar to one about Shakespeare adaptations. While purists like Lawrence Kitchen argue that putting Shakespeare on for a mainstream audience taints it, Some believe that Shakespeare's value is broadened, deepened, and made more relevant by interpreting it in the eyes of popular culture. 10 Things asks the same questions about feminism that it does about Shakespeare. Is a feminism that adheres to pop culture and that diverges from some concepts of the history of feminist discourse real feminism? So, as a member of the generation to whom 10 Things was originally marketed, I feel a strong obligation to defend the film and its feminism. And my stance as someone who appreciates the long history of feminist tradition, feminist discourse in the world of academia doesn't compete with that, but it supports it. So while many things about this film are problematic, even just in that trailer you saw a lot of the way Bianca is portrayed as really ditzy, and even parts about the resolution of the film are really sexist and problematic. The fact that its protagonist is a self-identified teen feminist and that the pop culture audience likes her for it is noteworthy in and of itself. In the more than 15 years since the movie's release, no self-identified feminist character has gained as much mainstream attention and adoration as Kat Stratford, which is really interesting and significant considering it's 2015. But so even if 10 Things does kind of water down feminism or obscure it from its intellectual history, it still reaches a mainstream audience with feminist values that are not commonly displayed in movies for teenagers, which could potentially inspire young girls to explore feminism for themselves. I know that this movie was probably one of the first times I heard the word feminist when I was a kid. The film is definitely not perfect, and perhaps it does not fulfill Diane Henderson's vision of an experimental filmic rendering of the resistant tale that is The Taming of the Shrew. But his perspective on Kat's feminism, her relationship with Patrick, and her taming are unique to this 21st century version, and they're definitely worthy of consideration. The brand of feminism purported in this film is similarly modern, and its reception as rejected by feminist scholars but widely accepted and championed by adolescents is distinctly emblematic of tensions existing within feminism right now. Despite its faults, 10 Things is ultimately valuable in that it supports female personhood and agency, and in that it provides a likable feminist heroine to a mainstream audience. So in the research that I did, I found, like I said, a bunch of criticism about this movie. And mostly in this paper, I just respond to the different arguments that critics have. So if you hear names, those are basically most likely people who hate this movie. So next, we're going to look at a clip about the relationship between Kat and her sister Bianca.
Joey never told you that we went out, did he?
Yeah, okay.
In ninth for a month.
Why? Because he was like such a babe.
But you hate Joey.
Now I do.
So what happened? Please tell me you're joking.
Just once. Right after Mom left. Everyone was doing it, so I did it. Afterwards, I told him I didn't want to anymore because I wasn't ready. And he got pissed and he dumped me. After that, I swore I would never do anything just because everyone else was doing it. And I haven't since. With the exception of Bogey's party and my stunning digestive pyrotechnics.
So for that reason, for Kat sleeping with this guy, even though they never say that, sleeping with this guy that Bianca has a thing for at the moment, that's the main reason that critics don't like this movie. So Kat's feminism for critics of the film does not count as real feminism, primarily because of its justification by this, rather than its representation as a legitimate set of beliefs that stand on their own. To these critics, the quiet misogyny of the plot is that Kat's feminism is not permissible in popular culture by itself, that Kat's relationship with Patrick restores her mental well-being, and that it needs this justification of this experience with a boy to make her a feminist rather than she's just a feminist. But if that were the case, if Kat's feminism required a reason, the audience wouldn't like Kat at the beginning of the movie. Kat's meant to be liked for her feminism, not just in spite of it, from the moment she rolls up to an intersection blaring Joan Jett's bad reputation. And her admission of having had sex with Joey before she was ready only humanizes her sometimes emotionally removed character and allows her to relate to her little sister in a way that she didn't before this point in the movie. There's nothing in the film to suggest that Kat wasn't a feminist before this, only that she used to do things just because everyone else was doing them before the encounter, and that after it she acts in accordance with her principles. Another critique of her feminism is that it's not concerned with feminist politics or values as a whole, but rather that it is purely a matter of style. And it is frequently associated with her camouflage tank tops and her dark ensembles, but she lives out her feminism in a way that transcends her outfit choices. The film takes measures to portray Kat's feminism as an intellectual and cultural practice rather than merely a trend or a fad. She listens to Riot Grrrl music, reads Sylvia Plath, Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, Charlotte Bronte, all those. And she strives to attend Sarah Lawrence, a historically all-female college known for its feminist learnings. It's definitely somewhat of a superficial and abbreviated history of feminism, but it's more than most films aimed at teenagers can really say. And Kat also engages in ideological criticism. In her commentary on, there's that one scene where she talks about in the classroom, the oppressive patriarchal values that dictate our education, and is made fun of for it. But, and she opposes not only the authority of particular men, like Joey or like her dad, but she opposes the inequalities of patriarchal culture through that commentary. But the most significant way that Kat manifests her feminism is through her decisions to be her own person, especially through this scene, and explaining to Bianca, assert ownership of her body and to help her sister step into that self-worth as well. The absence of real feminist concerns that Kat encounters is due to her age and station in life, not necessarily the film's neglect of problems bigger than prom. For a white upper-class high school student, navigating personal worth as a woman in relationship with or against sex, parties, and peers is a real feminist concern. And the millions of teenage girls watching this would probably agree. Perhaps Kat isn't affirming the personhood of all women, but she is declaring her worth as a person and as a character, demanding respect from her male counterparts and the audience, which is significant. For Kat, the political is personal, so she takes these big concepts that she sees and that she learns about and she applies them to her everyday life. And that makes what she's talking about more applicable and transferable to everyone watching her, which is specifically teenage girls. So, the next one we're watching is Bianca, her little sister.
Padre, listen. You missed the wrong guy. Now you're gonna pay. You and that little bitch.
Alright, that's enough, okay? You crossed the line. Oh, come on, get up, you little punk. Shit, Bianca, I'm shooting a nose spray ad tomorrow.
That's for making my day bleed. That's for my sister.
Oh.
And that's for me.
So that's obviously very different from the Bianca that we see at the beginning of the movie. Also, probably not the best definition of what feminism looks like, but we're going places. So part of the criticism of her feminism is that her relationship with Bianca is just not relevant to the rest of the movie. And although the sisters have a much closer relationship in 10 Things than they do in the play, critics cite the isolation of both sisters as a lack of solidarity between women and feminists in the film. The Stratford sisters' relationship is pretty crappy throughout the entire thing, but Bianca's transformation from a passive object of admiration by Joey to someone who's willing to stand up for herself, her sister, and her date in this way changes. Kat is emotionally vulnerable with her sister in that scene we saw before, and in a scene where they're talking about just conformity in general. And Bianca's vengeance, like this, all hint at this relationship of sisterly and feminist solidarity throughout the film, even if it's not necessarily stated. The way in which Bianca and Kat move toward one another on this feminist spectrum throughout the film is representative of feminism's current movement toward encompassing and embracing different identities and appearances of feminism. And the sisters' differing styles, social groups, and self-identifications, but their eventual agreement about their fundamental worth as beings, so basically that they don't want to be an object to be claimed and paid for by Joey, points toward a feminism that doesn't isolate femininity, popularity, or other identifiers that might have in the past seemed incompatible with feminism. Another part of the film that a lot of people hate is the resolution of the film in a love relationship between Kat and Patrick. And they ask why, if Kat is supposed to be a feminist, the film ends in a heteronormative and conservative way. Their attention to the inconsistencies in the film's feminist stance is indicative of our greater cultural tendency to think just completely in binaries. So, like, either Kat is a feminist or she goes to prom, which obviously we have a pretty good understanding that those two aren't mutually exclusive. Michael Friedman goes so far as to say that Kat abandons her feminist creed by accepting traditional male-female relations. But a critical tenet of third-wave feminism is its embracement of paradoxes and tensions. And Kat's character seems to support the idea that a young feminist can have it all: her strong values, her intelligence, and a boyfriend. And however unrealistic this may be, it presents an ideal of modern feminism to this film's young audience, and its reception has been out of the water, just wonderful support, even 15 years later. I found this article on BuzzFeed, and this is a quote from it. "Feminists are not shrews, but they're also not saints. Sometimes they're prickly and cynical. Other times they're gooey and swoon over like a really awesome guitar. Because feminists are people, even when they're passionate or angry. Because people get passionate and angry. And 10 Things I Hate About You showed that nuance to a mainstream audience. It showed a teenager very righteous in her feminism, who gets it, but also doesn't, and is still working stuff out. Aren't we all?" So the film's ending in a love relationship probably aims to serve this young generation of feminists searching for a human emotional aspect and personal ownership of the feminism that we learned from studying it and from our mother's feminism, which has a little bit of a hard exterior. Although it takes liberties with the original text in other aspects, this resolution could also be an attempt to remain true to the Shakespearean work where it ends in a marriage, and in Kat's taming. So in either case, it epitomizes Kat's transition from someone who steers clear of boys and relationships because of her past encounters to someone who embraces the contradiction of maintaining her political opposition to something, to patriarchy, while participating in the aspects of it that ultimately benefit her and give her pleasure, like the heteronormative sexuality. And this while some people see this love, resolution, and manifestation of emotion, if you guys remember, near the end, Kat recites this poem to the class and cries in front of Patrick, basically saying that she hates that she doesn't hate him for what he's done to her. And people see that, the reading of that poem and the showing of that emotion, as a failure of the film, as Kat kind of giving up her feminism in order to please him. But I found a lot of accounts of young people appreciating that aspect of Kat's character. Instead of a taming that involves breaking her spirit and ending in her obedience and subservience, 10 Things' taming involves both Kat's and Patrick's ability to transform and change for the better as a result of knowing one another. So they both change instead of just Kat being tamed. They're both meeting somewhat in the middle of this situation where Kat has to show emotion and forgive Patrick, but Patrick also has to show emotion and recognize the mistakes that he's made. The new Kat, who is equally strong as the one we saw at the start of the film, recognizes emotion within her life and vocalizes the hurt that she feels in the reading of the poem. Although this doesn't match the original bad reputation image of Kat, it's not necessarily an image of weakness, and it's definitely not one of relaxed feminism. Instead, Kat's emotional actualization represents sort of a beacon of hope to young feminists who realize that feminism was an actual, real, usable thing, and that you could pair a camouflage tank top with a string of pearls. Despite its refusal to delve into explicit feminist politics and theory, 10 Things takes a stance on the feminism of the generation at which this film was aimed. It tells young girls that femininity and feminism aren't mutually exclusive, that being female is inherently confusing and contradictory, and that sisterhood can ease such ideological struggles. So in its support for this distinctly modern feminism, 10 Things inevitably rejects aspects of second and first wave feminism. And critics have called its attempt to disavow its connections to the history of feminist theory psychological matricide. The absence of positive female role models in the film and the absence of older women completely is the most cited example of this. But there's arguments that 10 Things' representation of older women as absent or potentially abusive serves to ensure that we listen to our peers and not our mothers. But I don't agree, because I think that because this is a young adult movie marketed towards young adults, we're not supposed to have a bunch of adults telling us what to do in the film. As a young person watching Kat figure it out, you're kind of supposed to work with her and decide what you would do rather than listen to what her dad is saying. And the tradition of stories like this, where there's a group of young adults figuring something out with very little adult supervision, is pretty rich. And Austen's Mansfield Park and Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream have lots of examples of that, where there's an absence of significant adult influence, but the teenage characters must navigate situations and develop moral and ethical standards as a result of their actions and their mistakes. So the most direct instance of this in the film is what we saw earlier, Kat's decision to sleep with Joey just once right after Mom left, and her resultant growth of personal character, even though it hurts her at first. The heavily determined and socially constructed nature of young adult identity, fortified by the strength of peer influence on the teenager, substantiates the purpose of 10 Things' absence of adults. And it's not merely an absence of a maternal figure. Dr. Stratford, who you saw a little bit in the trailer, his concerns about his daughter's chastity are made out to be ridiculous and outdated. We're not really supposed to agree with him in any way. 10 things in most teen movies focus on teenage and particularly female agency, characterized by the teenager telling his parent to stop trying to control my life, something that I've said all too often. So there's extensive criticism on the brand of feminism that this movie shares with us. But there's something about a film whose feminism is appealing to a mainstream audience that I feel compelled to defend. Perhaps it's because I grew up both watching this movie and wanting to be Kat Stratford and learning about the history of feminism and studying it in high school and college. But if an era that seems to be shying away from a feminism with a capital F in favor of a feminism that doesn't call itself anything so as not to offend anybody can love Kat Stratford, that represents a victory. Even if Kat's feminism is not Bell Hooks approved. This movie is a site of cultural struggle in that it has great resonance with and praise from pop culture, as well as analysis by scholars and critics. And the film and its criticism are representative of the uncharted terrain that feminism is exploring right now. Tensions between those who discredit a girl power that benefits rather than threatens boys, and those who argue that feminism should benefit everyone, mount in a struggle that manifests itself at a point of widespread accessibility, pop culture. Despite the many problematic aspects of this film, I align myself with those who think that this film represents the means to overcome the shrewish stereotype of the feminist through Kat's presentation of third wave feminism. And although I don't think that feminism can be whatever someone wants it to be to achieve a certain end, I also can't condone the reservation of feminism for the intellectual elite when it, as an ideology, has the interest of half the population in mind, and that half includes teenage girls. So, that is all I have for you. And mostly I just wanted to open up discussion about what we think about the idea of adapted feminism and what it means for someone like Beyonce to perform in front of a 50-foot word feminist on a world tour, or something like Sheryl Sandberg, who wrote Lean In, which is essentially a feminist book without ever using the word feminism. But yeah, so what do we think about adapted pop culture feminism? What's good about it? What's problematic? I get how you feel now. Teachers. Yeah.
I think it might make it a little bit more like an individual goal instead of like a movement that you've seen in the past where like women banded together. So I think it, not that I think it's bad or anything, but I think it has the risk of being like making it where it's like, oh, it's your individual like decisions that matter instead of like a group of activists or women like together like calling attention to feminist issues.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mentioned that a little bit, just about how there's this danger of feminism being whatever somebody wants it to be in order to achieve what they want, which isn't the case, but which this like adaptation kind of allows it to be a little bit. But I don't know. Can I be done now? Can I sit down, please?
Are there any comments or questions for her about the film? Do you all think Kat is a feminist? Do you agree with Katie's reading?
Yeah.
One question I do have, like when you did your research, did you ever, because there was a TV series made in like 2010 about this, did you ever come across that, like try to incorporate that in research?
Yeah, I looked at that, and what's interesting is that, like I said before, this movie is still so popular 15 years later that like popular enough for a spin-off TV series with like the same names to be made of it.
Did you notice like any like differences like on the feminist view from like 1999 to like 11 years later?
Yeah, I think it's even less willing to call itself feminism. So at the beginning, I haven't watched the whole thing, but at the beginning of that series, Kat, has the same attitude as this cat, but there's less about actually studying feminism or calling herself a feminist, which I think is interesting. But kind of shows that as a culture, we're more widely accepting of feminism and less willing to call it feminism, which I think is interesting.
I would just comment that I haven't seen any of the show, but one of the things that we observed in our class was this really interesting difference between this film, which is from 1999, excuse me, and 7 years later, in the mid-2000s, you have the film She's the Man. Some of you perhaps know. I was interested by how many of my students knew that film really, really well. And that was in many ways so much less sophisticated a film in terms of the way it was trying to think about women, girls, gender, power, etc. And so we may not be able to attribute a total sort of devolution, if you will, but it would be interesting to see like what's happening, because the 2000s definitely seem to be a very different moment than the 90s.
Yeah. So why do you guys think that as a culture we're less willing to use the word feminist, even though feminism is definitely more available to people? Yeah.
So I think the word feminist has like a really horrible connotation nowadays. People don't take it in the same light as female empowerment. They take it in the same way as, you know, girls who don't shave and stuff like that. It's just not the same type of connotation.
Yeah.
Yeah, to like draw off of that, like man haters, like they're just gonna complain about whatever they want to complain about and hide behind feminism. Like they can just do whatever they want and say that they're repressed.
So how do you think that's different from 1999? Because I think all of the things that happened that give us that impression happened way before 1999. You know what I mean? You were going to say something, sorry.
Well, I think like for what you're saying is why feminism is like more available and more well known, where people are less likely to want to use the titles, because feminism has kind of like some problematic past and it's like developing and growing as a movement. So in the past it's had some like racist and classist problems, and so people who are like want to be more inclusive or like are like people of color, like of a lower class, might not want to be like associated with that. But that's kind of what we're seeing kind of in the film, is that she's sort of developing and growing, and like as she's learning more about what she wants to advocate.
Yeah, and that's a big change between just how feminism was studied in the past and how it's studied now, is that it's definitely, there's a lot more versions now of feminism than there were, I think.
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the bigger differences that also between like early 2000s or like late 90s to now is how much social media and kind of, I don't know, different values have changed. So I feel like feminism has become more of like a social issue and how women are treated in society versus like fundamental things like back, you know, in the early, I think it's 60s, I want to say, right? Yeah, history. But like women were fighting for the right to vote and kind of more like political things, which is like, yeah, like we deserve this, but now it's more just, we're talking about social things, which it's not like kind of, I don't know, more set in stone type of a thing. So I think that's also another bigger issue.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And kind of adding on to that, like the idea I feel like sometimes people are like, oh, we're all equal, like we've achieved equality, it's 2015, so there's like the post-feminist kind of like viewpoint as there's no need for it anymore, when like obviously that's false when you like look at ads and things that like talk about women, but I think there's definitely like a mentality that I hear that girls are like, oh, like we're equal, there's no need for it, but there's still like wage gap, so.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the ways that women are represented in films, on social media, in advertisements has changed, but not that much, and not as much as feminism itself has changed in the past decade even. Yeah.
Well, with the change in feminism and stuff, you referenced a lot of first and second wave and third wave feminism, and their first wave feminism is dramatically different from third wave. Third wave includes like things like transgender people, as well as people who are naturally born women and stuff. And like, to associate yourself as feminist, people still think back to the 1950s first wave feminists, where it was more of just like, we hate men, where nowadays it's changed, it's more of a broader group.
Yeah, I think something that I liked about this movie was that it has the idea of first wave feminism, like way back, like Mary Wollstonecraft, of personhood and being worthy as a human being because you're a human being, not because you're somebody's sister or daughter or something like that, which is really cool. So I think it has parts of those other waves in it, but that it definitely takes it a different direction, and kind of marks the beginning of that in 1999. But anybody else?
Can I ask a question about the movie? I haven't seen it, but I have seen She's the Man, which is great. And,
don't watch it.
And my question is about it as an adaptation. So as viewers, you go in knowing what's going to happen, because not only does it come from Shakespeare, but it's a kind of classic story. So when you see her at the beginning of the movie built up as a kind of badass, you know she's going to be broken by the end of the movie. You know she's going to end up with the guy. Heath Ledger's actually the top villain. It's Heath Ledger first, and then Julia Stiles second. So I guess the question that I have is, do people like her because of the way she is at the beginning, or do they like her because they know how she's going to end up?
Yeah. I think one thing that makes this a little bit different from my understanding, my watching this now or last year, from my watching it when I was in 7th grade, is that in 7th grade I had no idea that this was Shakespeare, and that she would eventually change, or I mean, I figured she'd probably end up with the hunky guy that's present at the beginning, but that's just kind of how movies work. But the generation that's watching this, the one in 1999 and the younger girls now, some of them might know that she's going to be broken by the end, but I think a lot of them probably don't. But definitely very interesting that watching it now, I mean, going into it, I wanted to hate the movie. Like, after taking that class and being like, oh, this is going to be terrible, she's going to be broken, and then, like, end up praising this guy at the end. Didn't want to like it. But mostly I think it's significant that we like Kat Stratford because she's a feminist and she calls herself a feminist, and that she still calls herself a feminist at the end, even though the way she appears to other people and to Patrick has changed. But yeah, it's a very good point.
So is the appeal partly that she could be a feminist and be recuperated somehow into something that looks like high school society?
Yeah, I think the taming in this movie is is not that she was a feminist and now she's not a feminist, but that she was a feminist at the beginning and didn't associate with guys or didn't want to be involved in a relationship, and then at the end understands more fully that feminism can include those things, which in my view is like an expansion of what's traditionally second wave feminism into, or like what people see feminism as, into what it can be now. Okay, well, thank you for coming. Yay.